Hello, I'm Bill Robb, a CUPE Education Representative. It's my pleasure to be here today with Dr. Linda Ray Murray. Welcome.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be back in Canada.
Great. Dr. Murray is the Cook County Chief Medical Officer in the Illinois Department of Public Health and also past president of the American Public Health Association. And I'm happy to report an ex-CUPE member from some time spent in Manitoba, in Winnipeg. I want to talk with you for a minute about the class basis of our society and within which this racism takes place, but other inequities as well. Many years ago, people could figure out what class they belonged to just simply by looking what their relationship to the means of production was. So, I mean, if you owned the means of production and you were wealthy, you were ruling class. If you owned the means of production with a small business, you'd be middle class. If you sold your labor to make a living, then you'd be working class. Now, that kind of simple analysis doesn't seem to work quite as well in today's society. So how do you see looking at class right now?
Well, I want to make a distinction. I want to come back to the more substantive piece you asked about, which is how has class structure changed. I'll come back to that in a minute. But this issue, especially with the situation in the United States, as Americans, we pretend class doesn't exist, And so how can you have a nation where everybody's middle class? The person who scrubs out the toilet in a hotel will say, I'm middle class. And the person who manages the hotel will say, I'm middle class. And frankly, often the person who owns the hotel will say, I'm middle class. That can't all be true. I think in North America, especially in the United States, but more and more in Canada also, it's almost as though people are embarrassed to say, I'm working class, as though there was something wrong with being a worker. So one of the problems we're facing is this cultural attack on labor and on workers. And again, it makes it easier when you're attacking workers if you pretend everybody's middle class and you pretend that the interests of a worker in a steel mill or a mine or in a sewage plant is the same as the interest of a small businessman or the same as the interest of a middle class businessman. And that's not always the case. So this is deliberate that we don't see that verbiage any longer. What is true in North America is that the economic conditions of workers, who are the vast majority still of Canadians and Americans, but also many of the small businessmen, small and middles, has actually been getting worse over the past 30 or 40 years. So again, that's why it's so critical and essential that this attack on workers, and we don't mention working class. So that's deliberate, and we just have to sort of wipe our eyes free of that. The real question is, who are our friends and who are our enemies? I have no problem uniting with some small businessmen if our actual interests are in common and we're fighting for the same thing. I have a problem giving up what we need as workers simply because the culture is defining what's needed by a group that is not us. That's the 1%. So I think that's the first thing to be clear about. We shouldn't be embarrassed for saying the word. And it doesn't mean that you have to be a worker just with your hands. There's nothing wrong with that either. I'm a physician. I'm a very highly paid public servant. But I am a public servant. I work for wages. So I'm not petty bourgeoisie. I'm not middle class in the true old-fashioned sense. Now, one of the things you implied with your question was, how has our concept of class changed over time? 100 years ago, it was really simple. The vast majority of workers worked with their hands. And the number of intellectual workers and technical workers were a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of workers. And that's clearly shifted, especially in North America, as we've evolved to more of a service sector, financial sector, etc. So I do believe that some of those old-fashioned definitions have to be tweaked or revised a little bit. But I don't think it's as hard as I'm not an academic in this area. This is not, I'm not an economist, so maybe I'm just thinking simply. To me, it's really simple. The question is, if you got laid off tomorrow, could you feed yourself? Now, if you're a farmer, and as long as you have crops coming in, you can feed yourself, okay? And if you're a small businessman, and even if half of your business goes away, and you may still be able to feed yourself. If you're a government worker and you lose your job, or if you're a steel worker, or if you're a miner, or if you're a secretary, most of us would be in big trouble. We could not feed ourselves, however long our little savings last. That's what we. So I do think that the nature of work has changed. We have much more intellectual and technical work than we did 100 years ago, but it's still work, and people still are dependent on their bosses, on the capitalists, to do it. For public workers, we're in a unique position. We really work for the people. To me, it's a fascinating problem that we have as public workers. In the United States, the attack on public workers has been tremendous in the past 10 or 15 years. We have a higher percentage of people being unionized in the public sector in the United States than the private sector at this moment in history. And so there's really an effort to really demonize public workers as though we were just stealing money from the public, as though we weren't the public. So I think CUPE as a union, and all of us that work in the public sector, have to really be in leadership on talking to our neighbors about this. We work for them, and so we need to say, well, wait a minute. If we do poorly, that means you're doing poorly. If we don't have safety in a water treatment plant, your water may not be safe. If we are overburdened in a hospital setting, your mother may not get good care. Your father may get bed sores. So if you put 42 kids in a classroom and you're a teacher, your kid may not learn how to read. So I think public sector workers have a special role to play in the labor union movement in North America at this moment. And that is, we can reach across the table to the people we're supposed to serve and say, our interests as public workers and you as public citizens, we have the same interests. And we have to try to change the nature of the discussion and make sure that we invest in what we care about. If we care about it, our kids, then we need to invest in parks and recreation facilities and schools. And we shouldn't be worried about raising taxes for that. Better that than for bombs. So I think public workers have a special role to play in understanding what class means in Canada.
So in the Canadian context, over 70% of the public sector is unionized right at the moment, and the private sector is 16 or 17%. So we're seeing exactly what you have talked about play out in the Canadian situation as well. So years ago, I had a favorite poster that showed a woman standing with her elbow resting on a fence. The caption was, "Class consciousness is knowing which side of the fence you're on. Class analysis is finding out who's there with you." Can we use this kind of simple way of looking at things to guide our union struggles today?
Absolutely, that's a great poster. I think that's exactly the point. And it's not. And let me tell you, most people are on our side of the fence, so that part is easy to understand. That really we're talking about a small minority in the world that, especially in the past 30 or 40 years, have just gotten greedy and out of control. We have a worldwide economic crisis, and the notion that we would tolerate this tiny minority starving kids all over the world, oppressing people, even in North America, is disgusting. The second challenge, class analysis, is much more difficult because frequently your neighbor that may be a fellow worker does not even recognize that that's what they are. And both in Canada, too often, not as often as the United States, but still too often, and in the United States regularly, workers vote against our self-interest.
And it is a challenge at the everyday level, that's for sure, because on the one hand you have economists telling us, and in fact showing us, that the middle class in North America is rapidly shrinking. And the fact is that 1%, the rich 1% is getting wealthier and wealthier. And then on the other hand, you have lots of working class people who consider themselves to be middle class. And what's going on there?
I think this is a problem of a lack of history. And when people see that in the paper, the middle class is shrinking, I think of my great-grandmother who says we're getting screwed. It's a very different perspective, okay? So I think people should think about that. My great-grandmother was born a year or two after slaves were freed in the United States, and she was crystal clear when I was a little girl. She would look at the news or read the paper, and she'd say, people like us are getting screwed. That's what's going on now. Workers are getting screwed. Small business people are getting screwed, but there are far more workers than small business people. So it's not that the middle class is shrinking as though we were an ice cube melting away benignly. Someone is actively messing with us. Someone is actively oppressing us. Someone is actively stealing our money. It's not that we're shrinking magically. And that's where the analysis comes in. And we will do better by joining together and supporting each other than we will by thinking somehow magically we're going to hit the lottery, or we're going to suddenly wake up and become rich overnight because we're going to have some brand new invention or some other ridiculous thing. Apple is rich because it makes products that are nice and sexy, and they oppress workers in other parts of the world to make them really cheap. That's why they're so profitable.
In North America, we still do have incredible resources and infrastructure, and really, when you compare it to the world, a relatively low population, and yet as a society, it seems like we accept homelessness, hunger, and poverty here in the midst of plenty. Why do we accept these injustices?
I think this has to do with how we think, what our ideology is. So we have a myth, it's a lie in this country, that we have a rugged individualist. We moved west, we ignored that we killed people when we did that. We went out and we tilled the land and we built the nation up, and it is the character of the new world that we value the individual. But the individual didn't get here by ourselves. You don't make profits off of a company by yourself. We collectively as a people, we clear the forest, we build railroads, we build highways, we build bridges, we build water systems, we build the infrastructure that allow ourselves to thrive, and yes, that allow business and the capitalists to thrive. So I think that we have to understand that really we built that fence collectively, and we tilled that land collectively. And if we are getting less than we used to get, it's because someone is taking more than they used to take. And what we have to do as workers is help change that dynamic and help people understand and see what's going on. It means tearing off the covers of what's really going on in Canada.
So given all of this that we've talked about, what kinds of things do you think union activists need to keep in mind as we move forward?
Well, the first thing that I would ask that people keep in mind always is our history. And we're taping this as 2012. January 1st, 2013 will be the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is the proclamation that President Lincoln signed to free some of the slaves. Didn't free all the slaves, but to free some of the slaves during the Civil War. That's only 150 years ago. That anniversary has real meaning to me. I think we have to think as Canadians, what is the history of this country? What is the history of my family, of my neighbor's family? What's the history of our union, of our industry, of our nation? If we ground ourselves in that history and really tear the covers off sort of the propaganda and lies, we'll see different people struggling for the same thing. They'll look different, they have different languages, they have different trajectories, but really what we all want as human beings are the same. We want a world at peace, we want families that we can support, we want to have communities that are solid. That's what we need to grasp and understand. When we do that, then we have some hope of making progress.